I just like to check it before I get started. Well, I think this is going to be it. So we'll go ahead and get started. As far as people, so I was hoping some more trickle in, but we might have some tricklers, but or we might. Yeah. Um, but let's open up to 162. I write the numbers on there because I just don't like to keep them in front of me. And Dawn, if you don't mind doing our opening prayer after our songs, I'd appreciate it. 162, this is one I kind of know, but you don't learn a song unless you practice it. And I know some of you know this song probably better than I do. So I will start it, but you guys will probably have to help me carry it. And we'll just do the first, second, and fourth tonight, the dotted ones. All hail the power of Jesus' name, let angels prostrate fall. Bring forth the royal diadem and crown him Lord of all. Bring forth the royal diadem and crown him Lord of all. Ye chosen seed of Israel's race, ye ransomed from the fall. Hail him who saves you by his grace, and crown him Lord of all. Hail him who saves you by his grace, and crown him Lord of all. Oh, that with yonder sacred throng we at his feet may fall. We'll join the everlasting song and praise him, Lord of all. We'll join the everlasting song and praise him, Lord of all. Our next song will be 490. That's 490. That last song was kind of a high one. I felt the strain on my throat a little bit, but it's okay. And I will do all three on this one. The song was stuck in my head today. And I like it because, at least in part, this is a song that teaches that no matter what happens, it is well with our soul. So we'll sing all three. It's hard not to sing all three on this song. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul, It is well with my soul. My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought. All right, this seems to still be working. All right, let's open up to Matthew chapter 7. We're examining the questions of Jesus as they're found in Matthew's gospel. But here in Matthew 7, we're still in the midst of Jesus' great Sermon on the Mount. And again, that's Matthew chapters 5 through 7. But in this sermon, as I've told you before, Jesus is teaching his hearers about how they can have a righteousness that is greater than that of the scribes and Pharisees so that they might enter into the kingdom of heaven. That's Matthew 5, verse 20. So it's in that context that as we reach chapter 7, among the things Jesus is teaching is that in order to have a righteousness that is greater than that of the scribes and Pharisees, one must have a righteousness or a religion, is another word we can use there, that is centered on truth. In other words, in chapter 7, it's about having a truth-centered righteousness. Now, one reason we know this is because beginning in verses 7 and 8 of this chapter, and going through verse 12, Jesus enters into a discussion where that uses the imagery. I'm just going to read it, and we'll see the imagery as we read it. Verses 7 and 8. We're not quite at the questions yet, but verses 7 and 8 say, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened." So again, we see this imagery of asking, seeking, and knocking. Now, I think these are verses we're familiar with. But when we talk about asking in a religious sense, what does that entail? What do we think of when we think of asking? Okay, questions, but in our relationship with God, I mean, questions would definitely be there. But what else do we normally associate with asking in our relationship with God? Prayer. Okay, so people see this ask and it will be given to you. They think prayer. And that's okay. But Jesus adds to that seeking and knocking. Those two things are not things that are usually associated with prayer normally. So since that's true, there seems to be something more than just prayer involved here. Because Jesus adds finding or seeking, finding, and knocking. Now, when you're seeking something, what does that mean? Looking for it. You look for it, you find it. But then knocking, what comes to our mind? Knocking on a door. You expect that door to be open to you. At least you hope so. So it's all these things that seem to indicate that there's more than just prayer involved here. What seems to be involved here is that search for truth, where first of all you ask for truth through prayer. At least that's one way. And then you go out looking for truth. You find it. And then you knock and ask for that truth to be revealed to you or open to you. Now, I hope this makes sense. That truth seeking is what's involved in these verses. Feel free to disagree with me, but if you do, we'll talk and I'll show you the truth. Just kidding. I've said that before, but I say it in jest. So it's this idea of seeking truth that I think sets the stage for the next two questions that Jesus poses. Now again, when we look at these questions and all the questions we're going to look at in these studies, we have to have some context to them. And the context for these two questions that we're going to be looking at is this concept of truth seeking. Now in verses 9 and 10, we find questions that deal with how a person is treated when they ask for truth. But in these questions, Jesus uses the image of the father and son relationship when this son comes asking his father for something in order to receive what he's asking for. So it's these questions that we're going to spend time with as we look at a couple of points about these. But before we get into the questions, any questions or comments on verses 7 or 8? Okay. So we have two questions, and in these two questions there are 2 points about how we are to treat one another in our relationship with each other as it relates to our relationship with God. But again, it's in that context of truth-seeking. The first point we'll examine from the first question in verse 9 is that we treat others with what is nourishing for them. And the second point we'll examine from the second question in verse 10 is that we treat others with what is beneficial for them. Now, after looking at these things, what we'll learn is the conclusion Jesus eventually reaches in verse 12 about treating others in the same way that we wish to be treated. And we'll talk about that when we get there. But let's begin by listening to these questions that Jesus asked, and then we'll look at these points. So Matthew 7, verses 9 and 10, we read, "Or what man is there among you who, when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he?" So again, these are 2 questions, 2 points, and use the image of this father and son relationship. The son comes asking for something. First point, verse 9, we treat others with what is nourishing for them. We have a scenario here. A man's son comes and asks him for a loaf. What's a loaf? Bread. It's a loaf of bread. It's really that simple. So with that in mind, one thing we should understand from this part of the verse is that one possible reason Jesus might be using this example of a loaf is because of what we read in Matthew 4, verse 3. If we jump, we're not going to go to Matthew 4, but in Matthew 4, we read about the temptation story. Jesus is out in the wilderness. Satan is tempting him. Now with that, I'll just ask you, what was one of the temptations that Satan gave to Jesus that involved bread? Mm-hmm. And what did Satan tempt him to do? Turn stones into bread. Now, whether or not Jesus has that in mind here, we don't know for sure, but it's a possibility. Another possibility is that Jesus uses this example because later on in Matthew 14, we read about the feeding of the 5,000, which was also a situation that involved bread. We don't know. Whatever the case, the point of this scenario is to show that the son is asking this father for a loaf, as we've said, a loaf of bread. So he presents the scenario. What's the question he poses? What question does Jesus pose? Okay, so that's the question. You won't give him a stone when he asks for a loaf. Now, it's here where we see a parallel to the temptation story. Stones, bread. So that's why it's been suggested that Jesus may have that situation in mind when he asks this question. But here, the point is made that a father would not give his son a stone when his son asked him for bread. So this question and the next one we're going to look at just imply negative answers. No, if the son asks for bread, the father's not going to give him a stone. Any questions or comments on verse 9? Okay. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verse 9 about how we treat others is that we treat others with what is nourishing for them. Through his question and example of a loaf, Jesus has shown that in our treatment of others, we are to give to others what nourishes them. As a result, when someone asks us for that which is going to nourish them, we're not going to give them something that is not nourishing to them. Now, as a result, we must be seeking to give to others what is nourishing to them. But that brings us into verse 10. The second point, we treat others with what is beneficial for them. Now here in verse 10, it's still the father-son relationship. But here in the first part of verse 10, what is the son asking for? Fish. Again, pretty simple. Now with that in mind, we also have to ask, well, why does Jesus use the example of a fish and not something else? It's again been suggested here that Jesus may be looking forward to the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 14 of Matthew. Because again, it wasn't just bread that we read about there. There was also a few fish in that situation. Again, we don't know that for certain. All we know for certain from this part of the verse is that this is a situation where a son is asking his father for a fish. What's that? What do you mean? Explain that a little bit, Don.
Well, you were comparing them to other things, and they
Yeah.
could compare very easily, as you said. But if the conclusion you draw wouldn't matter where it did or not.
That's true.
At all, I don't think.
Yeah, what Jesus might have in mind when he uses these examples, not important.
Doesn't hurt anything.
But it doesn't hurt anything to suggest. Yeah. Okay, I see what you mean. Okay, so the scenario, the son's asking for a fish. What's the question? You won't give him a snake.
That's worse than a rock.
That's well, that could be worse than a rock, and there's a few reasons why. But presumably, it's to eat. The fish is to eat. Question is, wouldn't give him a snake to eat, would you? So this is an important point to bring up. The snake, Jesus is not implying there's something dangerous here as far as, because the snake's not alive. If you're eating something, it's presumably dead. So that's not the point behind the example of a snake. But can anyone tell me how Jews felt about snakes?
They're pretty low in their esteem.
Okay? But what else was true about them in the... Okay, there is that. But what about in their diet?
Well, they wouldn't eat them.
It was a no-no. It was in that list of things that they could not eat. Ones that slither around. They were unclean. Now, yes, we hear snake. We might go back to the garden. Nothing wrong with that. But here, the Jew would say, no, we can't eat snakes. They're unclean. So again, this implies a negative answer. The son asks for fish. The father's not going to give him a snake. Not by any means. Anything else on verse 10? Okay. A lot of this is pretty straightforward, but we're going to make application of it here in just a little bit. But putting all these things together, the point we should see from verse 10 about how we treat others is that we treat others with what is beneficial for them. Now again, the examples here are a fish and a snake. But in using these examples, Jesus has shown that we ought to treat others in a way that would benefit them. Now this is seen in the fact that by pairing together a fish and a snake, Jesus shows that by giving a person a fish, you give them something they can have. But by giving them a snake, you give them something they can't have. Now again, these are just examples that Jesus uses that would be familiar to the first century Jews. But we might substitute it with something else that would fit with our 21st century mindset. So what's the point of these questions? When we consider these two questions together, the point we should be left with is that we are to treat people in the best possible way. We are to treat them in a way that is nourishing to them. We are to treat them in a way that is beneficial for them. But Jesus doesn't stop there. After we read verse 11, which we're not going to deal with today, we reach verse 12. Jesus says, "In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets." Now, here's where we're going to spend the rest of our time. We're familiar with this statement. What does our society today call that? The golden rule. Guess what, folks? The golden rule has its roots right here. Treat people the same way you want them to treat you. What does that mean? Right,
You would treat yourself well, normally.
right.
And
So if you want to be treated well, you treat others well. That's a good example. But Jesus doesn't just make that statement, he adds this other statement. For this is the law and the prophets. Now here's some Bible review that I've talked to you about before. When you see that word for after a statement, what does it indicate? It deals with what came before, but what else? It's a conclusion. Any other thoughts? Okay. When you see the word for, it is a conclusion. It does have to do with what came before, but in addition to that, it's a reason. So Jesus says, in everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. But then he adds, and these are my words, here's why. It's the law and the prophets. So let's deal with that phrase. What is this phrase, the law and the prophets, about? What scriptures? The Old Testament scriptures. When you see this phrase, the law and the prophets, especially in the New Testament, it's a general way of referring to the Old Testament scriptures. You have the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then the prophets is all the books of prophecy we have after that. But it's just a collective term for the entire Old Testament. So Jesus says, again, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. Well, why should I do that, Jesus? Because the Old Testament said so. But when you look through your Old Testament, you don't find a verse that says, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. But you do find the concept in what command? Love your neighbor. Mary hit it right on the head. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's what the golden rule is about. But Jesus phrases it this way because of what he's discussed. How a father would treat his son. But the idea behind this statement is love your neighbor as yourself. Now, what do we know to be true about that command, love your neighbor as yourself? Okay, sometimes it's a little hard to do. That's true. But what else do we know about that commandment? Okay. That's true. But what did Jesus say about the significance of this commandment? It's number 2. What's number 1? Love the Lord your God. And what did you say, Matt? Okay, love. But as far as the commands go, love your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That was number 1. Greatest command number 2 is love your neighbor as yourself. Now we see that, I'm just using this as an example, but we see that in the 10 Commandments. We see these 2 commandments in play in the 10 Commandments, because when you look at the first few commandments, they deal in our relationship with God. The rest of the commandments deal in our relationship with our fellow man. So when you boil the 10 Commandments down to 2 commandments, it's those 2. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Number 2 is love your neighbor as yourself. That's why Jesus says, for this is the law and the prophets. Because the Old Testament says, Treat people the same way you want them to treat you. Not in those words, but in that command to love your neighbor as yourself. Does this make sense? Okay. So, in addition to those things, what we should also know is that what Jesus says here in verse 12, we skipped it, but what Jesus says here in verse 12 immediately follows what he says in verse 11. God is our Father. He knows how to give his children good gifts to those who ask him. So what this should help us to understand is that treating others in the same way we wish to be treated is to treat others as God has treated us. The two go hand in hand. We imitate in our relationship with others what God has done in his relationship with us. Now, as these things apply to the questions Jesus has asked and the points we've examined, God has treated us in a spiritually nourishing and beneficial manner, and we're to treat others in the same way. Questions, comments on verse 12? Okay. So all this is verse 12 is the application of those two questions we just looked at. In everything, in all aspects, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. Last call, any questions or comments? All right. Dean, will you close us out tonight?